Well, we have now some time for discussion, and I think it is very important that we remind ourselves what we want is actually at the end of this 3 days that we have a plan for action. We want to do something. We don't want to lose momentum, because if we go away, everybody's back in the daily business and things fainting away. So let's concentrate our discussion and questions into that direction now, that we at the end come to a conclusion, say, yes, we are going to do something and set something into action. I open the discussion questions for all of the speakers, from Pavan to the last. I take 2 here. First, the lady in the back, and then you. 3.
Hi, is this on? Yes? No? Hi, my name's Rebecca. I've just graduated from a degree in agriculture and rural development.
If you keep the microphone up there, then we can...
Okay, sorry. I've kind of got a question for Pavan, but also to all of you. You're kind of suggesting that we should reorientate the system and shift our DNA. However, having done a lot of stuff on path dependency, especially in India, and knowing that it's mainly replacing the policy and maybe greening it, a new green revolution, a greener revolution, what are the costs of actually reorientating? Has that been taken into account in studies? Because at the moment we're talking about the externalities within one system and the alternative, but not the path to get there and the costs of that. And is that something that you've discussed?
Thank you. Next question. Microphone, please, here.
I have a question for Pavan. It seems that we look at externalities as something that can be quantified, and a lot of what we do about them is develop methods to get to some kind of a quantity that we can relate to. And usually what happens is that we get scared because it's so huge. But I don't hear the same level of insistence on what do we do with that number. I think even if it's didactical, I think it would be useful to just say, these are the 4 things that you do to internalize. Otherwise, we get into this notion that you internalize the externality by increasing the cost of the food or whatever the product might be. And we, I think, agree that's not the only one. So what are the other ways? And I think that as we think about the way forward, it would be good to be clear about what are some of these options for internalizing externalities, at least for the food sector in particular.
Thank you. There was more than one question.
I have just one quick question for Pete Seligmann. Given how fast the trends are in terms of ecological degradation and loss of species, and how difficult it is going to be to resolve the food system for all the reasons that we have been discussing. So we have an urgency and at the same time a challenge for how to address these root causes of degradation. I mean, as a conservationist, what do you think about that? I mean, how should we look at this dilemma, and how do we should distribute our resources to ensure that at the end we don't continue losing species, because you can repair ecosystems to some extent, but species don't come back.
Okay, there was one here at the end, the lady there.
Hi, Lauren Blake. Pavan and Peter both made very accurate and important points about our kind of current global system being really, really dominated by corporations now. Therefore, maybe is one of the ways forward, and how would we go about this, is trying to convince these corporations to adopt true cost accounting. How do we make it beneficial to them, so that is, if we can't change the fact that they're dominating, then how do we get them to adopt true cost accounting?
Okay, I take 3 more. One was here. The one, no, the gentleman there, not you, and then 2 up there. And then we go in the round here. Yeah, it's you, yeah.
Thank you. Jeff Tansey, a couple of points. One, I wonder if talking about these as externalities is actually part of the problem. Because it's like drugs. Drugs don't have side effects, they have effects. It's our economics and the way it's structured that has the effects. And maybe we should be thinking more deeply about the nature of the economics that we've got, because this is part of the problem. Secondly, we actually are not really addressing the issues of power and the mechanisms by which the powerful maintain and extend that power. And what we've seen in corporate structures is the ability to rewrite the rules of the world through, for example, the rules on intellectual property in the World Trade Organization, through the rules in these new economic partnership agreements, which allow companies to sue governments to do the kind of things that you're talking about. So I hope you're thinking about those issues as well, because without addressing those and putting them in a framework of equity, which many governments don't believe in.
What are your questions, actually?
They're points for them to say, are you thinking about these? Because if you're not, you're missing part of the picture.
Okay. I guess that was a statement for all of us, or was it for somebody specially? For all of us. For all of us. Okay. Then the two gentlemen there. First, the one on the left.
Christopher Bielenberg. Addressed primarily at Peter Seligmann, actually. Thank you, Peter, for your encouragement that corporations were taking a more positive approach due to their enlightened self-interest. Unfortunately, I think the reality is, having had experience of some of these companies myself, is that the life cycle of the average chief executive in these large corporations is really quite short. They have a very short lifespan and a relatively short mission. By contrast to that, non-executive boards have a responsibility to long-term shareholders, to pension funds, and therefore they have a fiduciary duty to respect long-term success and therefore the long-term sustainability of those businesses. There seems to be a fundamental mismatch in that. In that connection, I was happy to hear from all the talks that we've heard today that nobody has really mentioned the alleged new technologies that are going to save the world from poverty, and nobody has even referred to them in this whole conversation over the last 3 days with any great detail, which I think is massively encouraging, because what we're saying is actually by changing the processes, the systems, the education, and changing the biodiversity, we will lead to the shortage, the elimination of the shortages of food without the help of Monsanto or anybody else.
Thank you.
Guy Duke. I've got a question for Mike, actually. Mike, you showed some appalling figures on loss of bird diversity in England, in the UK. And you also showed a very interesting graph, which I've not seen before, showing the disparity between the resources available under agri-environment, under the CAP, the Common Agricultural Policy, and the amount that is required to safeguard biodiversity. And approximately, your graph showed that we're missing about half of what we need. Now, as you know, the government has put forward a proposal for offsetting, which we've calculated for the recent Ecosystem Market Task Force, would bring forward resources which would equal the agri-environment payments, so another 400 or 500 million a year. So where do you, as a conservation group, stand on this? There has been quite a lot of radical green voices in the press against the prospect of offsetting, but there is a potential there to revolutionize conservation in the UK.
Thank you. I think that question with regard to corporations was more or less to everybody, because I think everybody can say something, but maybe we start with you then, Peter, and then have the others also have a point on that.
So I guess there are two ways that I look at the not only the role that corporations can play, but why I believe that it is there, and it is evident, or it will shortly be evident, that it is in their enlightened self-interest to do a much better job, a much more responsible job. Supply chains are threatened. Availability of resources are threatened. The last thing that any company wants is a lack of predictability, unless it's in the hedging business, and there are some that are in that, where they don't really care, is insecurity. So I think that the two things that have really driven very poor corporate behavior has been the lifespan of the CEO, and I think that's accurate, and has been the quarterly report, which really drives kind of a need to have a short-term positive return. Enlightened self-interest means that you're looking at from the board's perspective, is that you're looking at kind of the long-term value of that particular institution. And that is directly connected to behavior. It's directly connected to the public understanding and appreciation, which is connected to social media, and it's connected to your license to operate, and that's why I think that we're seeing a shift in companies, some companies, thinking through these issues. The other part of this is companies operate within a context, and that context is a geography. And what is really crystal clear is that African nations, for an example, it could be South Pacific Islands, and it could be Asian nations, it could be any nation. They are really concerned about their own future, and they can set rules and they can change rules. And what we are seeing, and I'm experiencing this whether it's in Indonesia or whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa or whether it's in the South Pacific, are leaders, communities saying that we need to take control over what happens with our own resources. We can no longer be mined, extorted, destroyed by external forces. And that is an extraordinarily important transition. And all you have to do, if you want to understand the pressure that's on a country to do a better job, is look at what's happening in the Ukraine right now.
Okay.
And that happens all over the world.
Good. I think we get the same question now. You have two more questions to answer later, but I go first to Pavan. And if you could answer those two questions as well as the question of role of corporations. And then I come back to you with the two other questions.
Sure. I'll try and combine my answers, so apologies if it may not be too specific on. Now, there were two questions, in fact, three on the what next, as I see it. Guillermo, you phrased it as, after the scare, what? So actually the scare, which is from the size of corporate externalities, is the first point of educating the corporate management of their true impacts and bringing them to the space in which Peter's comments go, which is essentially what I call stakeholder capitalism. The need for awareness by the corporation's management that the days of shareholder capitalism will need to change. You need to think beyond that. There are issues to do with the brand, with customers, with social media, with ultimately the social license to operate. But the second dimension of that change that will happen is the realization that actually externalities today are costs tomorrow. And these externalities can be internalized, as we say, in other words, become costs, in broadly two different ways. One is through event risk, and the other one is through regulatory risk. Event risk is what happened to BP. As a result of their actions and their neglect, and as a result of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, they had to put in a $20 billion provision. Their capital stock suffered a loss of something like $70 billion over the first, and they're still paying fines which have totaled up to an estimated $40 billion. So the assessment of externalities of that oil spill, which was in the order of $60 to $300 billion, was actually not off the charts. It was kind of reasonable. So that's event risk approach. And the other is regulatory risk, and His Royal Highness talked about in his speech the issue of the polluter most definitely does not pay. But the polluter will pay so long as one knows what they're supposed to pay and what for. So establishing the quantum of damage, the third-party costs of business, the externalities, basically is sometimes, and can be, a step towards change in regulation. And smart management and good management will always anticipate regulatory changes because that's an exposure which is known in the jargon as regulatory risk. as in the risk of regulation changes that potentially destroys your bottom line. Self-interest, long-term self-interest, what Peter talked about. So these are the ways in which the sort of externalities language and logic and calculation converts into action at various stages in time. One final quick point, I think there was a question here on the, completely right, I mean the nature of economics, absolutely. The very fact that for so long the difference between price and value has been ignored, and now it's become almost a religion to do so, and the very fact that how can you call as externalities events and impacts which are so significant economically, and it's almost illogical to use that term anymore now.
Okay, thank you very much, Pavan. Mike, you also to the specific question you had, but also the role of corporations you see.
Yeah. Well, let me deal with the specific first, because that introduces another point. So I think the first thing to say, that graph I showed, I think it would be to conflating the point with offsets. I'll come back to that very briefly in a moment. The graph I showed, remember, that is only, the money that is going into the public goods there from Common Agriculture Policy is only about 10% of the budget. There is bags of money available if government policymakers so determined to actually put towards the public interest of addressing the negative externalities of the food system we have. That is not the shortage, and that was my point about the distortion between public interest and public policy. But with regard to offsets, I think, again, just to be clear, essentially what we've got, and what I was talking about there, is a revenue problem. This is the cost of managing ongoing high-value sites. And indeed, high nature value farming is one of the ways of addressing that. With regard to, in a sense, moving natural assets around, yes, there is a role for offsets. We certainly would agree with that. It is a bit like nuclear fusion, great in theory, difficult in practice. And so it has to be done, it's an approach that needs the right, measures around it, and I'm happy to discuss that outside. I think with regard to corporates, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I'd also go back to the point, I think, Pavan, you made this point, that we're in an era where I believe the societal change we're going through, politicians broadly will follow, not lead. I think business does have a role, but actually it's times like this when civil society, we have to make sure that we are helping hold the ring on the evidence base. As has been said over the last couple of days, we make that accessible to people, and we create the platform and space within which not only enlightens self-interest, but actually a sense of what is good and what is right to be done. Because you can look at the game theory modelling, and actually humans are innately more altruistic than game theory says. And at the end of the day, we're going to need negotiators at multilateral talks to be there believing they've got to do this for their kids, not just for national self-interest.
Thank you. And Anne, how do you see the role of corporations in your work?
Well, let me talk about the role of corporations more generally. I think there are 2 points on the corporates that haven't been made. And one is that in addition to being concerned about their supply chains, there's also a concern about investment risk. So when a company that's highly dependent on water, like a Nestle or a Pepsi-Cola, is starting to look at making an investment in any country, they want to know what the water situation is going to look like in 30, 40, 50 years, because they're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. They also want to know what the situation is going to look like in terms of endangered species, because they know that could cause them to have to stop operating or change how they're operating. So I think we also need to think beyond just the supply chain focus that we've been talking about here. And the other point I would make is that the company that I used to work for had decided that it really does care about the sustainability of supply chains. The CEO was there for a long time, but told me he was having real difficulty getting that vision translated down to the actions of the managers on a day-to-day basis, because they didn't know how to set the incentive structure for those managers to do the right thing. So even though the corporation at the high level had the vision and were messaging it as they needed to do, they couldn't get the traction that they wanted to. On this question of sort of what do we do, I've been surprised at how little we've talked about environmentally damaging subsidies. And when we look at the U.S. Farm Bill, for example, the cap, for example, what was just shown in Thailand, the fertilizer subsidies in India, if we just got rid of some of these environmentally damaging subsidies, we would be far down the road in dealing with these issues. And it seems to me that given the budget pressures that a lot of our countries are under right now, this is a good time for all of this community to start putting even more pressure on that conversation. I will say one more thing. This week or next week, the trade ministers are meeting in Bali to try to finish this long-standing, long-expiring Doha round. And one of the things that escapes mention is that the developing countries are arguing that they should not have to have any disciplines on their subsidies. Now, in a way, yes, that's important because they need to be investing in roads and infrastructure and all the things that you need to be productive. But they're getting a pass on some of these environmentally damaging subsidies. And I think we really need to start paying more attention to that going forward because many of these countries are going to have the money to put into subsidies, and we don't want them to go the wrong direction.
Thank you. We have two more questions to Peter, but please be brief because we had all kind of secondary speeches. You had two more questions, or did you answer everything, you think?
No, I think Guillermo asked me a question, which with the acceleration of extinction rates and the loss of species, do we have time to take our eye off the ball of protection while we go through the transition into sustainability? The obvious answer is no. We don't. We can't. We have to, let's put it this way, we have to multitask. And the multitask basically means that we have to secure places that are reservoirs of natural capital or ecological diversity as we go through the transition into sustainable production. And to achieve that, we have to be able to more effectively make the arguments as to why we need those reservoirs of natural capital secured. That means we have to be able to explain what do they provide for people? What do they provide for the wealth, health, survivability, livability of our societies? And that's the reason that we did the flip at CI to go from focusing on the protection of human well-being and supporting human well-being as opposed to biodiversity, because we felt we have to really focus on that argument that gives the politician the cover for being able to actually, and the understanding of why you have to take an action to protect the place. We cannot be only focused on one. And if we are just focused on one, if we just focus on protection, we're not going to make the transition we have to make in the way development takes place. And if we just focus on development, by the time we get that thing fixed, there's not going to be ecological resilience left. So that's the answer.
Okay, thank you. We are actually out of time. And I want to finish on time. So unfortunately, I cannot allow you any more questions because we had questions actually as speeches and we had answers as speeches. The discipline was not very good on question and answers, I must admit. We do it more strictly, actually. Allow you 3 sentences as an answer. But I think one important message is here, and it's 2 directions. One, which I'm not really very much in favor that we need more and more and more data. We do need some more data. But on the other hand, I think we could have this old Indian proverb that says, if you think you are approximately right, do something. Instead of being, after years of research, exactly wrong. And that's the situation we have. I think we need to act on one side and need to get more data on the other side. We cannot do it either or. I think we have to do both. And that is very important for us. But the key to me is still, and you all said that we need to get this message to those who can really act. And the message, I agree, is through civil society. Because politicians, they change their mind, they change their behavior, And I'm not really, in contrast to some of you here, the great believer in the real change of companies. I do not believe it. From my knowledge, I know a lot of companies, that is a lot of greenwashing and lip service. And I'm really hoping they will do what you have seen that they will. I'm very doubtful. So we need to work on politicians on one side and on the companies as consumers on the other side. Those are two. Thank you very much. And we are back after the